but what risk would you want to share with your tenant? So, price of crops, production and yield of crops, the input cost for those crops, or possibly a combination of those. So, price and production, or all three, price, production, and input cost. So, I'll give you just a minute here to go ahead and answer that poll. All right, we got about half of you, so give you just another 10 seconds here. I think, Jeannie, you could go ahead and share those results.
Okay, I'll do. Okay, here we're ending the poll and sharing our results. Well, it's kind of skewed one direction here with a little bit on the other.
Yeah, so it looks like most of you want to share price, production, and input costs with your landowner, assuming you're mostly tenants or farmers answering this. Price and production is the next one, and then a couple people just said that production or that yield. I will say, if you really want to share price, production, and input costs with your landowner, a crop share lease is the way to go. I think if you try to build that into a flexible cash lease, it gets complicated pretty quick. I will say I've seen people do it and do it successfully, but it's where there's a really good relationship and trust between the tenant and the landowner, and the tenant runs all their calculations, knowing their cost of production, and then provides that to the landowner, and they trust whatever outcome is what is fair. So so that being said, everything I'm going to talk about is typically price or production or both. I do not get into input costs with a flexible lease arrangement. Okay, so let's just go through here a little bit on some examples. So my first one really is the net share. So if you're in a crop share arrangement now, say, our traditional is 1/3, 2/3, where your landowner is getting 1/3 of the production on the ground, but they're paying 1/3 of the fertilizer, typically chemical, maybe seed. So what you could do is just move to a net share. They would still be receiving the crop, but again, they would not pay inputs in the net share. So my example here, and this is not a recommendation, just an example, but what if 25% of the production went to the landowner instead of 33, but they don't pay inputs? So 22.5 bushels delivered to their local elevator. They market it as they like. So you're still sharing the price and production risk in that situation. Do know that the landowner also would have to do their own crop insurance, work with FSA, none of that stuff would actually change. So I wouldn't call this a flexible cash lease, but I just kind of explain what net share is when we talk about it. Okay, the other one that I would call here fixed bushel rent is something that you're probably familiar with out in Western Kansas. So here, the landowner is going to receive the cash equivalent to a certain number of bushels multiplied by the harvest price. Now, there are multiple ways of doing this, but the way I'm doing it, it's only flexing on price. So in, let's say, a year that we're producing wheat, if our normal farm yield is 40 bushels per acre, doesn't matter what it actually yielded, that's just the normal yield. The landowner would receive 22% of that as their payment, so 8.8 bushels times whatever the price is at harvest. And then you can see what the landowner income would be. Again, this is a cash lease. They're not actually receiving those bushels. They're receiving the cash equivalent of those bushels at the harvest price. The third one, and I think this one is probably one that you haven't heard of very much, and I call it a crop insurance flex. Basically, it's using crop insurance information to set the rental rate. So I have a Milo example here. So the base price for Milo is actually in discovery period right now. So it's looking at the futures market for corn throughout the month of February, the daily settlement, and then after March 1st, we'll get the base price for insurance. So let's say right now 450 is just an example. You would multiply that by the normal farm yield. So, the APH would be your crop insurance yield before some of the adjustments. So there's the revenue of the farm. And what you do is just, again, a certain percentage of that would go to the landowner as the rental payment for the year. So I use 22%. Again, that's just an example, but it would create in this example about $69.30 of rental payment to the landowner. And again, how this would flex is each year that crop insurance base price would be used. So next year, let's just say we have $6 Milo, that would automatically adjust the lease up. If next year we have $3.50 Milo, that would naturally adjust the lease down. So it'll adjust price year to year. And I think the neat thing on this is that you know by March 1st what that rental payment is going to be. So it's a little more transparent, and the landowner knows what their income will be pretty quickly in the year. Okay, so the next two examples are just really kind of getting into the true flex rent that you probably think of when you're thinking a cash flex rent. So in my example, I think this is the easiest way as examples. If the landowner and tenant agree on $50 an acre and their normal corn yield is 70 bushels an acre, $4 corn price this year is kind of what's anticipated. So you can see this is the revenue from the corn crop. The landowner's going to get 50, the tenant's going to get 230. So that's kind of what's set at the beginning of the year. Now, what if we get to the end of the year and corn price increased to $5? The landowner and tenant share this extra income. Again, this one is just a bonus on price, not yield. So if it's $5 times the 70 bushels, you can see this is the 350 an acre. It's $70 over the revenue they anticipated. So they're going to share that extra revenue. I have right now the landowner gets 30% of the extra revenue, the tenant gets 70%. Now, again, it's just a recommendation, but I do believe the tenant should receive more because they do have the risk. They probably have crop insurance, but they still are carrying the risk of that yield. And this is only flexing on price. And that landowner's guaranteed that $50 an acre. So there is not a flex down. Now, here's a different outcome. What if at harvest the corn price is $3? So it went down. Really, in this situation, even though you have less revenue, that landowner is still guaranteed their $50 an acre. That's the base price. So they would be getting the $50 an acre. The tenant would be only 160 an acre. Hopefully, they'd have some crop insurance, revenue crop insurance kick in at that point. All right, one more example here, and then I'm going to talk about some nuances of some of these leases and how to handle them in different crop rotations. So my fifth example is a true cash lease flexed on revenue. So same situation I just talked about. They're going to agree on $50 an acre at the beginning of the season, $4 corn price, $70 bushel, so that's the same as it was in my last example. But now at harvest, again, the corn price increased to $5 per bushel, but they also had an increase in yield of 85 bushels an acre. So they're going to share this extra income both on the yield side and on the price side. So if you take $5 per bushel times 85 bushels per acre, you get $425. Again, they already anticipated 280, so that becomes a $145 of extra income. And then they're going to share this extra income. I have 40% now going to the landowner, 60 to the tenant. Again, that's not a recommendation, just an example. But since the landowner is participating some in that yield risk, I just gave him a little more. But again, this is not my recommendation, just an example. Kind of same scenario. Well, what if we got to harvest and the corn price was the same, but the actual corn yield wasn't 70 bushels, it was 50. And so we have less revenue. Again, the landowner's still going to get their base amount. The tenant would get less, but again, hopefully their crop insurance would kick in and they wouldn't actually experience that loss. So overall, how this works, I would make sure that 50 is below the normal cash rental rate. So you're starting a little bit less than you would with a straight cash lease. And then you would have those bonuses kick in if things are better than you anticipated. So that's kind of the gist of how this lease works. Okay, now there's a couple things that I want to make sure if you're going to go into this that you make sure you define. The first one is price. So I had a lot of example prices in there, but you really want to define what is price. So the futures market, you have Chicago Board of Trade or Kansas City Board of Wheat, or you can use those. Know there's going to be basis risk between what those are running and what the actual cash price is in your area. The other one, I use crop insurance prices. Those are very publicly available. Look at a whole month of futures prices and set that amount. So that's a very nice, clean, easily researchable, undisputable number. Cash price obviously is used and is the most accurate for the actual farm revenue. So if you're going to do this, I would specify the elevator that you're going to look at for the price. There is some USDA regional reports as well. You always run the risk of what if that report gets defunded and not available. But there is a lot of different ways that you can do price. The other issue is when. So do you look at what's the last day of harvest? What's the cash price on that day? Or the average daily price for the entire month of harvest? Maybe an average throughout the year. So my example here, if you did June 1st, October 1st, December 1st, what's an average of those three prices? One thing I tell my landowners is also consider when you want the check, because say we harvest here in the fall, you really can't have a price going over the end of the year if you want to receive that check in the same calendar year. So these are all things I think you need to discuss and make sure you have in writing in your flexible lease. The other issue is government payment and crop insurance. So when we traditionally think of risk management, ARC, PLC, our normal farm bill programs, I usually don't consider these, and that is because, as you all know, you harvest the crop. It takes a year, the next October, to get your payment when we're talking about corn or milo. If you're talking wheat, it's a year and a half after harvest that you might get your ARC or PLC payment through Farm Service Agency. So that's really hard to build into one of these leases that the landowner wants a check by the end of the year. If you're doing a crop share or net share, that's possible. But otherwise, the ones that we've gotten lately, I would say, are going to be a little different. So the Farmer Bridge Assistance Program, that's going to be paid later this month. The ECAP program that was out last year, those are outside the Farm Bill and typically happen more quickly. And so to me, if you do have a flexible lease that has a pricing component, some of those ad hoc payments that are supporting price maybe should be shared with the landowner as well. So again, something to talk about. It's just different the last few years than it has been in the past when we get those large payments because of the low crop prices. Crop insurance, I would say this one is typically no, that you don't share that unless there is a flexible yield component within the same year that, you know, again, this is kind of a special situation, I would say, but typically I don't recommend flexing with the crop insurance component in there. All right, just some other considerations here. I always recommend flex rents be put in writing. That way there's no dispute what the parameters are, what prices are you looking at, and things like that. And make sure, I'm talking as you're the tenant, make sure your landowner understands. I think some of the disputes around flexible leases are just the landowner didn't understand the parameters that they were signing and getting into. And then when things didn't turn out like they thought, they get upset. So you don't want to cause a dispute because you're going to a cash lease and or flexible cash lease and things are just not that good right now. So make sure they understand. Keep it simple. You can make these extremely, extremely complicated, but I would start simple. And then as you build that relationship and understand how that flex rent is working, you could do more parameters within it. The other thing I didn't talk about, should there be a maximum amount? I'm going to show you an example in a little while here. why it can get pretty costly pretty quickly when we've had good crop prices. So maybe thinking about that, if the landowner's always getting a minimum, should there also be a maximum? And then how often should you renegotiate your flex rent? Most of leases that are not crop share, I would argue, should be every 3 to 5 years be renegotiated. The way things are moving right now, commodity prices are very volatile. So in a flex lease, if you're just starting it, I would say you want to review that every year almost, especially every 3 years, and make sure it's doing what you expect. Some of the difficulties, it is more complex. Obviously, it is a lot easier to just write that check, stick it in the Christmas card, send it to your landowner at the end of the year, and away you go. But, it is kind of a cool tool if you can get it set up appropriately, that as a tenant you don't have to withstand those high rental rates when we have low crop prices like we do now. It's really, if we can get that rent set up uh, how it should be, that should flex and give you some relief in years that we have low commodity prices, but then also just automatically share a little higher rent in those years that we have really high crop prices. But again, it requires more working knowledge on the landowner's part. And the thing that I want to get into next is, if you have fallow, if you have wheat, if you raise any annual forages, or if we were in southeast Kansas, if you have double crop, things can get pretty complex on these. So that is what we're going to get into next on the flex lease. If you're not dealing with some of those things, my examples that I went through 1 through 5 are a really good way to just do a normal year-to-year flex lease. So I'm going to get into a wheat corn fallow crop rotation, but I'm going to pause here. Jeannie and any of the panelists, presenters, are there any questions before we move forward?
Robin, it doesn't look like we have any questions. I would just tell everybody, if you have questions, you can go ahead and put them in the Q&A box. And Robin, if there's something that comes in that we need to slow you down or have you answer a question on a specific slide, we'll jump in here. So, but I think it looks like we are good to keep on rolling.
All right. Yeah, so I know I went through some of that pretty quickly. So if you have questions or feedback, please type it in the chat or type it in the Q&A. I am going to leave some time at the end too, that we can have some back and forth too about some of the questions or situations that you've dealt with. So,
Sounds good. Thanks, Robin.
all right. But I guess for now, I'm going to keep trucking along and talk about flexible leases specifically in the western side of our state. So I know there's a lot of different crop rotations out there. I'm just using kind of our traditional wheat, corn, fallow one, just to walk through what a flexible lease could do in this situation. But no, what I'm going to walk through you could do with any type of crop rotation that you have. So as all of you know, we're going to plant wheat, harvest it plant wheat in the fall, harvest it in the next summer. We'll plant corn the following year, harvest it that fall, and then have that long fallow period before we go back to wheat. So the thing that landowners need to understand, and if they're in a crop share lease now, is they're only going to get 2 crops every 3 years. So as a landowner, they have to be prepared for that. Now, flexible leases can handle this in a number of ways. So the landowner could agree to just receive rental income when the crop is harvested. So again, if they're in a crop share, they should already be used to this. So in my rotation, they're going to receive a payment 2 out of 3 years. Now, in a flex lease, I'd say this is probably the easier way to do it. The other thing you could do is that landowner would get a payment every year. So if they're in a cash lease now, maybe that's what they want to stay with. But how you would handle this is you wouldn't have an actual yield component in your flexible lease. So it'd be flexible on price only. So each year the landowner would get a blended payment of your normal crop rotation. So in my example, each year they would get a third of what the wheat payment would be, a third of what a corn payment would be, and then a third of nothing because it's fallow. So this calculation would be run every year, and that's the rental payment they would get. So I'm going to show you an example of that here in a minute. But to make sure you're still awake out there, this is our last multiple choice question, and it's a little different. So if you're a landowner, I want you to answer either A or B. So if you're a landowner, should the tenant pay you every year or only in the years that a crop is harvested? If you're a tenant, you want to click C or D. So C would be you only do a pay or sorry. C is the landowner receives a payment every year regardless if a crop is harvested. D would be the landowner only receives payment if a crop is harvested that year. So I'll give you a minute to go ahead and answer that question.
Okay, we've got answers rolling in here.
I think last time we got up to the mid-20s and how many
Okay.
participated. We got a few more here that are still thinking, I think.
Okay, looks like we're at 21 respondents. We'll give you just a couple more seconds. 3, 2, 1. Okay, boy, somebody got in there right under the wire. Okay, here we go. Robin, there are your results.
Okay, so if you're a landowner, it looks like 4 of you would prefer the tenant pays you every year. 2 of you are okay if the tenant only pays when the crop is harvested. If you're a tenant, it looks like you mostly prefer that the landowner receives a payment every year, regardless if a crop is harvested. That one's actually a bit of a surprise to me. And then that fourth option, the tenant pays the landowner only if a crop is harvested that year. So overall, it looks like most prefer that the landowner receives a payment every year. So we'll use that information going forward. Thank you for doing that. So the next, basically end of my presentation, I'm going to look at a case farm in Northwest Kansas and kind of do a study on if we had these different kinds of rents in place, what would be the outcome over a 12-year time span. So I, again, am doing a wheat, corn, fallow rotation. So over 12 years, we did 4 complete crop rotations. Now again, you might be switching your crop rotation up, be doing milo instead of corn, or some combination throughout those 12 years. So this is something that you could do on your own, but I just want to kind of show you the framework of how to evaluate when we have a flexible cash lease in a crop rotation like this. So the ones that I'm going to go through, basically 6 different rental situations. If the landowner is going to get paid every year, they're either going to get a cash rent, so straight cash amount, or a fixed bushel rent. If they're going to get paid just in a year a crop is harvested, I have 4 different options that I'm going to walk through. So maybe after seeing this, you'll change your mind in how often the landowner should get paid. So here's kind of my first 2 situations. The landowner gets paid every year. So I'm using the National Ag Statistics Service cash rental rate for this, the county this farm is in. So this again is a survey that goes out. A lot of you have probably received one. You fill it out, it goes back, and these are published in August every year. What is the average cash rental rate for dry land, irrigated, and pasture leases in your county? So that's kind of our base scenario, that a NAS cash rental rate, and that would be paid once a year on your tillable crop acres. So the fixed bushel, again, is the other way that I think would be easy to do a flexible cash lease where the landowner gets paid every year. So let me break down how this works on my example farm here. So my normal crop rotation, again, wheat, corn, fallow. My normal yield is 90 bushel corn on this farm, 40 bushel wheat. So the landowner is going to get equivalent to 25% of this normal yield each year. And again, 25% is an example. You want to run your own numbers to see if that is equitable for you. So their yearly payment to the landowner would be a third of the corn. So again, 25% of the normal corn yield, that would be 22 and a half bushels of corn every year, times the harvest price. Then they're going to get the wheat, so 25% of the normal wheat yield. So 40 bushel wheat, that's 10 bushels times the harvest price. And then fallow. So obviously not going to receive anything from your fallow. But here it would be a third of the corn, a third of the wheat, and a third of the calculated fallow. So if we did this over the last 12 years, what I'm using is a cash wheat price for Northwest Kansas, a cash corn price, and using this same formula every single year to come up with what the landowner's payment would be. Now you can see there's the average is $48.92, so almost $49 an acre over the last 12 years. But there are years such as 2016 where they got as little as $33 an acre. We had very low crop prices in that year, but we also had a high of 93. So war in Ukraine was broke out that February, I believe. So I know $10 wheat and almost $8 corn seems like a very long time ago, but that is what drove those differences and how that lease self-adjusts through that 12-year period. Again, it's the third of the corn, a third of the wheat, and a third of the fallow calculation every year to where the landowner would get that cash rental payment. So I'm going to compare this again. Now these are the ones where the tenant gets paid or tenant pays the landowner only in the years they're harvesting the crop. So my first comparison is a net share. And again, this is not a cash lease. This is where the actual crop goes to the landowner. So in my example, 25%. It gets delivered to the local elevator. The landowner markets the crop themselves. They still would be getting 25% of the government payments, having their own crop insurance on 25%. So this is kind of my comparison for those leases that are paid only when a crop is harvested. So on my farm here, this is kind of how that comes out over the last 12 years. These are the actual farm yields in those years. So again, the landowner's getting 25% of that yield. So let's say in this year, 26 bushel wheat, 25% of that is 6.5 bushels. And then they can market that crop however they want. I'm going to use the harvest cash crop price in Northwest Kansas to kind of get a proxy of their income. So you can see their bushels times that cash price is their income for the year. I guess I didn't have anything circled here, but it came out to about $46 on average. But again, there's some years that is pretty low, and there's some years that it's very high. And every 3 years, they don't get any income. Again, in the net share, they're not paying expenses though. Okay, so here is a revenue flex. Basically, I'm going to set base rent at $40 per acre. That is the minimum amount that the landowner will receive regardless of what happens. Now, when we're looking at what actually happened to compare to that, the crop revenue I'm using is the harvest cash price times the farm's actual yield. So these are the same yields you saw in the last one, how many bushels of corn and wheat were produced on their farm that year, the cash price for Northwest Kansas. So that becomes the farm revenue. Now I'm using 25% again, but this is something that is not my recommendation, just an example. If you took 25% of the crop revenue of the farm, that's what those numbers would be. And then you compare back to, well, if that's more than 40, then the landowner gets to share in that bonus at 25%. If it's less than 40, then they get the 40. So let's look at a couple years here. Again, 2017 was low crop prices. 25% of the farm income was only $35. So the landowner gets the base amount of $40 an acre. Again, that's the base price. This lease is only flexing up. The other one I've highlighted here is, again, when we had some pretty good corn prices, we had farm income of $126 if you take 25% of the actual farm income. So that created a landowner payment of $126 per acre that year. But overall, again, if you averaged through these 12 years, if you're following me, they're coming out quite similar. But the landowner would have averaged at about $46. But again, would have to withstand the highs and the lows and benefit from those highs. Okay, same thing you could do, but flexing on price only. So I think you're kind of following me here. I'll start going through these a little quicker. Base rent, $40 an acre, same as the last scenario. Now the only difference is you're using the cash price at harvest, but instead of the actual farm yield, you're going to just use the expected farm yield. So no flex on price. The one advantage here is, if you're using some technologies and things that are increasing yield, and as a tenant, you want to benefit from those, that does give you the opportunity to do so a little bit more than our last option. So again, what we're going to do is just use the expected farm yield instead of the actual farm yield. Harvest cash price. Here's our farm revenue. 25% of our farm revenue are these numbers here. And then you compare that to the base rent. So in this year, again, that I pointed out before, we had low crop prices. So the 25% of the farm revenue was less than 40. So the landowner is going to get 40. In years where things are good, so 25% of the corn revenue was 120, they're going to get that 120. Overall, they're still around the $40 to $50 an acre average over those 12 years. One thing I should point out, I'm not adding in any government payments or crop insurance. Those are things that would inflate that rent a little bit if you did that, but I am not in these scenarios. Okay, and finally, my last example here is that crop insurance flex. And that again is where you're just looking at the crop insurance number that is set for, so for wheat, that would be in the fall. For our corn, that would be in the spring. What is the normal base crop insurance price? And then multiplying that by your expected farm yield to get your expected farm revenue. So in this one, there's no actual farm yield or cash price at the end of the year. This is the one that you on March 1st can set your rent, basically. So here's those numbers: base crop insurance price, expected farm yield. Here's your expected farm revenue. I use 23% here, goes to the landowner. So you can see those different prices. And again, the average is around that same amount. So, but you can see the years that we had lower prices, so $30 an acre, this one actually withstands those lower prices a little more and gave more to the landowner, but it didn't give so much on the high side when we had really high crop prices. So you're probably wondering how these things all compare. So if we stacked all these 6 different arrangements up over the last 12 years on my farm with the wheat corn fallow rotation, really the average over 12 years in dollars per acre is not that much different. Again, you could change some of the percentages that I'm using, but overall they came out pretty similar. In the past 5 years, you can see my flexible arrangements were a little bit higher in 6 years. And that's because we had some really high prices in that 6 year time frame. But if we look at the past 3 years, so just the past 3 year crop rotation, some of them are actually less because, I mean, less compared to cash rent because we've had lower crop prices. The other thing to look at is the minimum and the maximum. So some of these are going to have bigger swings than others. And obviously these that aren't paying the landowner every year are going to be zero in some years, but then make up for it in other years. So just to kind of plot that same information, so the red would be your average cash that the landowner would receive throughout those 12 years, and then the gray would be the lowest and the highest amount that they would receive. So again, just the spread that the landowner would receive versus the average. Obviously, all of these in some years are going to be zero. So that is actually the last slide that I have other than my contact information, which is there. But I know we have about, looks like 9 more minutes, so we have plenty of time for questions and feedback. So I think, Jeannie, why don't we go ahead and see if we can get some comments going and some discussion.
Good deal. Okay. So, Robin, there is a question that came in a fallow year, who gets paid? But then the second part of this is actually who takes the risk if you have a cover crop out there? So,
So that, yes, that's obviously something that's going to add more complexity to the flex lease. So kind of the first part of that, if it's a fallow year, in my examples here, the landowner doesn't get paid unless you are doing that cash rental rate or that fixed bushel. Otherwise, I know in a lot of crop share arrangements, that's kind of a difficulty in that third year where you have the expense of planting that wheat crop and the fertilizer, but no income until the next year. But in a flex rent, like I'm talking, there's no expenses, nothing would get paid. Now, cover crops, that is, I guess, whenever I hear cover crops in a lease arrangement, my first question is, what is your goal? If your goal is to put forage out there for grazing, and that means that there's some income on that uh, cover crop, then it's a little different question than if we're putting it out there for erosion, if we're putting it out there for weed suppression, to maintain cover, then it's a different story. Because to me, that is a benefit that both the tenant and the landowner should share in. So I know that's not a straight answer, but again, it really depends on what the goal is and which of these lease types you are in. But I always encourage my landowners, talk to your tenant about cover crops. If they're wanting to do it, it's great. And there's a lot of benefits. But if it's adding to the long-term soil health and value of your land, that's something you should be sharing in as a landowner. So
great. We have another question that came in here, and I'll invite the agents to keep an eye on some of this too, in the background. So there's one that says, what's the average long-term landowner payment as a percentage of land value? What is their return on investment?
yeah, so we call that the rent to value ratio. How much cash rent do you receive versus how much the land is worth? I don't have it in this presentation, but I will say that's been interesting to track over the last 20 to 25 years. Because it used to be 20 or 25 years ago, you could expect about a 6% return on your irrigated ground, 4 to 5% return on your dry land, and 3% on your pasture. Nowadays, that is much, much less. And that's because land prices have gone up way quicker than rents have gone up. So right now, when we're looking at dryland crops, 2 to 3% would be what I would consider a cash rental rate versus the land value. So, and actually in this case farm, I had that number as reference. It was about 2.5% is what all of these arrangements equated to. Pasture rangeland, 1% is about what you can expect these days in cash rent versus the land's value. And again, it's just because we've seen land values increase so quickly that the cash rental rates haven't increased as much.
Okay, good deal. We have another question that came in. Okay, this is, how does the type of lease tend to affect the duration of the lease arrangement? It seems like a lease flex would lead to multi-year agreements.
Yep. So I would definitely agree with you. When we look at lease durations and how long between negotiating, there's a lot of crop shares that haven't been negotiated in 20 or 30 years and they've self-adjusted and that's fine. But yeah, if in a flex lease, ideally, if you get it set up to where it seems to be working, there shouldn't be a whole lot of reason to have to renegotiate that. I would say it's definitely worth looking at every 5 years after you initially get comfortable with how it's working, but it could it could keep going. It wouldn't have to be renegotiated near as often as your normal cash straight lease. And I think that's the beauty of it.
So this didn't hasn't shown up in the Q&A box, but how often do you recommend that landowners and tenants sit down and talk through these types of arrangements? Do we do it only when we're getting to the end of our lease, or is this a constant conversation on how to go about this?
Yeah, and that's a great question, and I'm going to give the economist answer that it depends.
Right.
Um, I feel like things have been moving so quickly lately that negotiating more often is so much more beneficial. And I'll give a couple examples there. We have a ton of leases that are way higher than they should be for what the input costs are right now and what the commodity prices are. But to negotiate those back down are very difficult. Usually they go up and they don't come back down. The other part of that though is when did you negotiate last? Because if you didn't negotiate your lease in the last, I'm going to say 5 years, maybe it should go up because your landowner didn't get the benefit of the crop prices we had in 2021, 2022. So I always argue when I get asked that question, where should or where should rents go up or down this year? It really comes back to when it was negotiated last. And I really like to see 3 to 5 years, just because of how quickly things are moving these days. I think there's an argument of maybe being made that you could do it every single year, but I know that's extremely difficult for both sides to do.
Okay, any other questions coming in on this? Robin, where do they go if they are looking for some guidance on doing lease arrangements, navigating these different types? What do we have for resources and where should folks go to get that?
Yeah, that would have been a good thing to put on my final slide here. So maybe one of the agents could drop it in the chat, but agmanager.info is our website out of the Agricultural Economics Department here at K-State, where all of our outreach extension work is housed in one website. And there's a really good section under farm management where there's a land buying section and a land leasing section. And we have a lot of information up there. We have form leases if you want to go to a written lease. We have examples for crop share, for cash, livestock leases, facility leases, anything like that. There is a vast amount of resources up there. And if you can't find what you're looking for, contact your local extension agent, contact Jeannie, contact me. We're all here to help you.
Great. Thank you so very much, Robin. Okay, with that, I will turn this over to Sandra and Stacy. Stacy, do you want to give us just the information to get us done with webinar today?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Jeannie. Yeah, we thank you. Thank everybody for joining us and staying with us. And if you would, please just take a few minutes to fill out the brief questionnaire. It helps us to see if we were on target. You can probably put in there other things that are on your mind, other topics as well. But if you would just take a few minutes to fill that out before you leave. And we do thank you once again for joining us.
Thanks, Stacy. I would just add on there the poll. There are two questions on the poll, so if you guys would answer both of those questions, if you would email me with your to check out for anyone who has CCA credits. So just go ahead and email me at jfalkjones@ksu.edu. And finally, I just want to invite you guys to come back next week. So next week we have webinar, same time, same place, and we'll be on talking about available soil water and how that might available soil water at planting, excuse me, and how that might affect some of our management decisions. We have Augustina Bohr, our K-State soil scientist at Hayes, and John Holman, our cropping systems agronomist down in Garden City. And so they'll be joining us next week, and then we have 3 more sessions after that. So we would hope that you guys would join back with us. You will get a reminder email since you've signed up for Crop Talk about when that will be happening. If you have any other topics that you would like us to cover, please just put them in the chat box, in the Q&A box. And with that, I think we will conclude for the day. But thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for filling out the poll question. And with that, we'll call it to an end, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Jeannie, I did have the slide up. Could you not see it?
I can, Sandra, yes.
Okay, so it was up because I didn't see it up. I saw you.
Yes, it's up.
Okay, good.